Have you ever wondered why Chinatowns are called Tang People's Streets? Because they're named after the Tang, the single greatest age in all of Chinese history. An empire that was in its day exactly what America is in ours. Militarily, culturally, the most advanced power on earth. And the man who built that golden age, the one history would crown the greatest emperor China ever had, is about to make the biggest decision of his life. The gears of his fate are turning toward the darkest turning point he will ever face. To understand that gate, you have to go back 9 years. The Tang did not grow out of a golden age, it crawled out of the corpse of one. The dynasty before it had squeezed the land to death. Canals, conscription, famine, revolt in every province. By 617, the capital was no longer a seat of power, it was a prize. A frontier warlord raised an army to seize it, but the truly dangerous one was not the father. It was the second son, Li Shimin. A young man who won the battles hardened generals swore could not be won. In 618, the dynasty is born and the warlord takes the throne. By birth, the crown goes to the eldest son. The second son is made Prince of Qin and sent to do what he does best, conquer. But he did not conquer alone. He drew the deadliest generals and sharpest minds of the age into a black armored brotherhood, the most feared cavalry in the land. But the man who would matter most carried no lance at all. His closest friend since boyhood, his brother-in-law, the brother of the woman he loved. This man would stand at his shoulder on the morning of the gate. Years later, he would be the one who pushed hardest to put Li Shimin's chosen heir on the throne. And he would outlive Li Shimin long enough for one last reckoning to tear the house of Li in two. Remember him. This whole story comes to rest on him. 621. Two great rivals still stand between the Tang and the whole empire. One holds the mighty eastern capital, the other marches to save him with an army of over 100,000. Li Shimin seizes a narrow pass and holds it with 3,500 picked men, his black armored cavalry, the spear point. Then he shatters an army 30 times his size and takes its king alive. One rival king captured on the field, the other, seeing it was over, opened his gates and surrendered. Two of the Tang's greatest rivals broken in a single campaign. His father had a problem. This son was too great for any rank that existed, so he created a new one. Heavenly Strategist, a title invented for one man and held by almost no one since. From that day, he was no longer just the emperor's son, he was the Tang war machine itself. And that was the problem. The throne already had an heir. His elder brother, the crown prince, held the throne's promise, and a powerful faction of his own, everything but the war glory. The crown prince and their younger brother, the Prince of Qi, saw it clearly. This man would not stop at second place. The court split in two. By the histories written later, poison once found its way into Li Shimin's cup at a banquet. He survived, but the message was clear. The general who had almost never tasted defeat was losing the only war that mattered, the one inside his own family. It would come down to one morning, him or them. In the summer of 626, by the histories written afterward, his brothers moved to strip his command, and he believes to take his life. Li Shimin strikes first. He turns the guards of the northern palace gate, the Xuanwu Gate. Before dawn, he leads his men inside and lies in wait. The crown prince and the Prince of Qi ride in, uneasy, but they come anyway. Halfway they feel it. Something is wrong. They wheel their horses to run. Li Shimin calls out to them. His brother turns, draws on him, and 3 times the bow fails him. Li Shimin draws. He does not miss. The crown prince of the Tang dies at his brother's hand. Moments later, his fiercest general runs down the Prince of Qi and shoots him dead. Two brothers, one gate, one mourning. But Li Shimin is not finished. Soldiers ride to the dead prince's households. 10 of his nephews are killed that day, the sons of both dead brothers. They aren't just killed, they are erased, struck from the imperial registry as if their bloodline had never existed. While it happens, the old emperor is boating on a palace lake, not yet knowing how far it has gone. Then the general comes to him, in full armor, spear in hand, straight to where the emperor sits. It isn't protection, it's a verdict. His sons are dead. The army answers to his second son now. Legend, not the official record, gives the old emperor a curse that morning. You have killed my sons and grandsons. One day your own descendants will do the very same. Remember that curse. It would come true 3 times. And the first time was the one no one tells you about. 2 months later, the old emperor hands over the throne and withdraws as a retired sovereign. The Prince of Qin becomes Emperor Taizong of Tang. Here the story should have curdled into tragedy, a throne built on a brother's corpse. Instead, it became the standard every later emperor would be measured against. The man who had murdered his way to power became one of the most admired rulers China ever knew. It was as if Richard III, having butchered his way to the crown, turned around and ruled like Marcus Aurelius. And here is the most disturbing part. He didn't win over history by hiding the blood. He won it by actually healing the country. He cut taxes, and he listened. His sharpest critic had once served the very brother he killed. He made the man his conscience instead. More than 200 times, that minister told the emperor to his face that he was wrong, and the emperor swallowed it and changed course. But there was one person who could check him as no minister ever could, not a courtier. His wife and the sister of his closest friend. She knew the histories cold and used them to argue the emperor down. And when his temper flared and he swore to kill the minister who kept defying him, she put on her full ceremonial robes, bowed, and congratulated him. A ruler only earns ministers that honest when he is great enough to deserve them. She was his brake, his conscience in silk, the one wall his pride could never knock down. The histories say roads went unrobbed and people left their doors unlocked at night. In 630, his armies destroyed the Eastern Turks and brought their Khan back a captive to the capital. The kings of the northern steppe gave him a title no Chinese emperor had ever held. Heavenly Khan, ruler of the farmlands and the steppe at once. This was the golden age. It was real. The praise was earned. And that is what makes the gate darker, not cleaner. The greatness never washed the blood away. It only wrapped around it. After the gate, Li Shimin had one last war left to fight. Not on any battlefield, in the historian's brush. He couldn't bury what he'd done. Everyone knew his brothers had died at that gate. What he could do was decide what it meant. By tradition, one rule was almost sacred. An emperor does not read the court's private history of his own reign. He asked to see it. His historian refused him. No emperor, he said, had ever read his own history. So he demanded the official chronicle instead. And he read how the morning at the gate had been written down. Then he gave an order. Cut the empty words. Write it straight. Straight, his straight. The brothers became the plotters. He became the man forced to strike first or die. He didn't hide the killing. He made history take his side. That is why 1,000 years later, we know exactly what happened at that gate, and still argue over how much of it is true. He had conquered his enemies. He had conquered the record, but no man conquers time. In 636, the empress, his break, his conscience in silk, died young. The conqueror of everything wept like any man, and built a high terrace just to gaze every day toward her tomb. Then, in 643, the mirror broke too. His honest minister died. And soon after, Li Shimin learned the man had quietly shown his blunt remonstrances to the court historians, making himself look good for the record. The emperor, who had rewritten his own history, could not forgive another man for managing his. In a rage, he toppled the tombstone he had written for the minister with his own hand and broke off the marriage that would have joined their houses. He had smashed his own mirror, and without it, the undefeated god of war made the worst decision of his life. In 645, old and ailing, he personally led a vast army against the kingdom of Goguryeo. He smashed fortress after fortress, and then hit one that would not fall. 60 days. Then the cold came, and the grass froze, and the food ran out. The man who had barely known defeat in his life turned his army around and went home, beaten, stopped by a single town. On the road back, he said it out loud. Had my old minister still been alive, he would never have let me go. He went home and raised the tombstone again, but the mirror was still broken. And now the conqueror began to fear the one enemy he could not behead: death. So the greatest emperor in Chinese history did something he had spent his life mocking the tyrants for. He sent men across the world for the drug of immortality. He took in a foreign holy man who claimed to hold the secret of eternal life and set him to brewing elixirs of cinnabar and stone.
The man who surpassed the first emperor was now repeating his last, most desperate mistake. And while he chased forever, his father's curse finally came home. His own sons had been watching how a man takes a throne in this family. His crown prince plotted to storm the palace and seize the throne by force, to do to his own father the very thing his father had done at that gate. The curse in his own lifetime. He had edited it out of the histories. He could not edit it out of his own house. When it was uncovered, the conqueror of everything broke. Before his ministers, he drew his own blade and tried to take his own life. They wrestled it from his hands, and so to stop his sons from killing each other over his throne, he made one last bitter choice. He passed over his bold sons. He chose the gentlest, weakest one, precisely because that son was too soft to ever do what he had done. And the man who pushed hardest for that gentle prince was his oldest friend, a choice that also served the friend's own grip on power. He picked the son least likely to repeat the gate. What he never imagined was this: by choosing the weak one, he had doomed the House of Li to a reckoning many times more terrible than the gate itself. In 649, Li Shimin died at around 50. By some accounts, the elixirs meant to make him live forever were what killed him. The man who conquered rival kings, the Khans of the steppe, and history itself was undone by the fear of dying, exactly like the tyrant he had surpassed. He left the throne to the gentle son, and the gentle son to the care of his oldest friend. But the curse his father left him was not finished. Like a shadow lurking beneath the golden age, it would soon come due and bring a new storm of blood down upon the House of Li. Welcome to the Dragon Files. Subscribe for more.